Courtney Vucekovich thought she had met a dream, a man whose presence consumed the room, whose attention felt like sunlight in winter, whose charm was so thick it wrapped around her like silk, soft, smooth, and suffocating in ways she didn't yet understand. When Armie Hammer first entered her life, he didn't do it quietly. He came in like a storm, unpredictable and exciting, drawing her in with late-night texts, deep conversations, and a kind of intensity that made her feel chosen. At first, it felt magical, intoxicating even, the way he complimented her intelligence, the way he asked questions that felt meaningful, the way he listened with full-body attention. But what Courtney couldn't see in those early days was that she wasn't being loved. She was being studied, sized, and slowly shaped into something that would suit his darker needs. The red flags were there, but they were wrapped in romance, delivered with flowers and passionate kisses and wild declarations about fate and soul ties. He told her he had never felt a connection like this before, that she made him feel free, and she wanted to believe him, because who doesn't want to? Believe in something that feels bigger than themselves? But behind his gaze, there was something else, something unspoken, something cold. As time passed, that charm began to rot, slowly, subtly, like fruit left too long in the sun. He began testing boundaries, not just physical, but emotional, asking her to do things she wasn't comfortable with, pushing her limits with a smile, cloaking manipulation in seduction. And every time she hesitated, every time she showed even a sliver of resistance, he would retreat, not with anger, but with withdrawal, making her feel guilty, like she had failed him somehow. And so she gave in, piece by piece, until her reflection no longer looked like someone she recognized. What scared her most wasn't just his words. It was how natural he made the darkness sound. How casually he spoke about things no one should speak about casually. He whispered about violence with affection, asked about blood with fascination, talked about flesh like it was food. And when she recoiled, he would laugh, call her vanilla, say he was just playing. But Courtney knew, deep down, in that primal place inside every woman, that he wasn't playing. This was who he really was. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a kink. Maybe she was the one who didn't understand, but her gut screamed something different. The emotional abuse was layered. Compliments turned to criticism, support turned to control, love turned to fear, and through it all, she was made to feel like she was the unstable one. That's how it works. They make you doubt yourself before you ever doubt them. He'd disappear for hours, then come back with sweet words and explanations that made her feel foolish for even questioning him. It was a cycle, a pattern, a manipulation, so precise it left her breathless. And still, she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because he made her feel like she had no choice. Because leaving meant losing him, and losing him meant losing the version of herself she had become addicted to. But even addiction has a breaking point, and for Courtney, that point came the day he said it out loud, "I want to eat you." Not metaphorically, not romantically, literally. The way he said it, slow and sincere, made her blood run cold. It was the final crack in the illusion, the final proof that what she had feared was real, that the man she had trusted was capable of things she had only seen in nightmares. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just froze. Because sometimes, when terror finally catches you, your body doesn't fight it, just survives. And that's what Courtney began to do, survive. Survival, for Courtney, didn't look like escaping overnight. It looked like smiling through the fear, pretending everything was okay while her mind screamed for answers she couldn't find. And heartbeats pounded like alarms that no one else could hear. Armie had a way of making everything feel like a game, a test, a performance, a fantasy crafted so meticulously that by the time you realized you were drowning, it was already too late. He would talk about dominance, not just as a preference, but as a lifestyle, about control, not just in bed but in every corner of life, and Courtney, once confident and clear-minded, began to feel like a puppet strung along by invisible threads. She lost her appetite, her sleep, her laughter, not all at once, but slowly, cruelly, as if something inside her was being siphoned out, day by day. She would catch herself staring into the mirror, eyes sunken, skin pale, wondering how she had gone from being someone so full of fire to someone who couldn't even speak without rehearsing what he might approve of. He never raised his voice. That was the terrifying part. He didn't need to, because his silence was sharper than any scream, his gaze more punishing than any slap, and his affection so conditional that she began to crave even the smallest crumbs of it like they were oxygen. When she tried to pull away, he would reel her back in, with sweet apologies, poetic texts, promises of normalcy, always just enough to give her hope, always just enough to keep her hooked. But that hope was laced with fear, and that fear became her reality. Courtney started having panic attacks, short, gasping moments where the world spun and her chest tightened and her body remembered things she hadn't allowed her brain to process yet. The night he tied her up without asking, when he whispered that she was his property, when he described the knife he wanted to use, her body went cold, her soul retreated, and she began to float outside of herself just to make it through. It wasn't passion. It was terror masked as intimacy, pain masked as pleasure, control masquerading as desire. And still he smiled, kissed her forehead, told her she was special. The worst part was that some part of her still wanted to believe him, because to accept the truth meant accepting that she had been manipulated, violated, erased, and that realization was almost too much to bear. She stopped telling her friends the details. They wouldn't understand. She stopped journaling. The words made it too real. And she stopped dreaming, because even in sleep, she couldn't escape him. Everything was about him, what he wanted, what he needed, how he felt, and she forgot how to want anything for herself. When she finally confided in someone, when she spoke the words out loud, "He scares me," she began to feel the weight of it, the shape of her own fear pressing against her chest like a hidden bruise. And still, people asked, "Why didn't you leave?" As if abusers always look like monsters, as if emotional violence doesn't wear a handsome face, a tailored suit, and a soft voice. But Courtney knew better, because she had lived in the belly of the beast, and he had called it love. Courtney didn't leave all at once. She left in pieces, quietly at first, packing away parts of herself before she ever touched her suitcase. Because escaping someone like Armie wasn't about slamming the door, it was about finding the courage to believe you deserved to leave in the first place. She started deleting texts, hiding screenshots, gathering memories like evidence, not because she needed the world to believe her yet, but because she needed to remind herself that it wasn't just in her head. Some days she would stare at the messages, the ones where he spoke of breaking her ribs, where he fantasized about cutting her skin and tasting her, and she would shake, not just with fear, but with rage, because she had once thought those words were twisted jokes, and now she saw them for what they were, confessions. Armie didn't want love, he wanted ownership, and Courtney had given everything she had, her time, her body, her mind, until she was left hollow, like a shell of the woman she used to be. Friends started to notice, not because she told them, but because the light had gone from her eyes. The spark had been replaced with shadow. She stopped showing up, stopped laughing, stopped living, and when people asked what was wrong, she smiled the way women do when they are too tired to explain. He had trained her to be silent, with guilt, with charm, with carefully placed affection that came just often enough to keep her hoping, but never enough to make her feel whole. She began to write again, not in journals, but on scraps of paper she would burn after, not to forget, but to survive, because sometimes getting it out was the only way to keep it from swallowing her. There was one night, long after he'd gone, silent when she woke up gasping, sweat dripping down her back, the echo of his voice in her head, that chilling phrase he used so often. "You're mine." It played like a broken record, haunting her thoughts, poisoning her peace. She realized then that the abuse hadn't ended. It had just changed form. He no longer texted her, but he still lived inside her. The control hadn't vanished. It had been internalized. And that's what made her speak. Not because she wanted revenge, not because she wanted headlines, but because she wanted freedom. She wanted her voice back. So, she reached out, first to a friend, then to a journalist, then to the part of herself that still remembered what truth felt like. And when she finally told her story, when she described the pain, the manipulation, the sick fantasies, something inside her shifted. It didn't make the memories go away, it didn't erase the trauma, but it gave her the one thing she hadn't felt in months: control. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was reclaiming. And that, even more than justice, was what she needed most. When Courtney went public, the world didn't erupt in applause. It split in half. Some believed her instantly. Women who had lived through the same psychological warfare, who recognized the signs, who saw her not as a scandal but as a survivor. Others, louder, crueler, faceless behind screens, called her a liar, an opportunist, a drama queen who just couldn't handle kinks. It didn't matter that her voice cracked with truth or that her story matched so many others, because when a woman speaks against a man as powerful, handsome, and celebrated as Armie Hammer, people don't want facts, they want reasons to discredit her. The headlines rolled in, tabloids spinning her pain into clickbait, strangers dissecting her trauma like it was entertainment. And through it all, Courtney stood still, not because she wasn't shaking on the inside, but because she knew if she didn't hold herself together, they would tear her apart. She cried in bathrooms, smiled in interviews, took deep breaths before reading comments, and let herself break only when no one was watching. This wasn't healing. It was war. Oh, war for her sanity. A war for her truth. A war against the culture that would rather silence women than believe them. She watched as Armie's reputation began to crumble, roles dropped, agents walked away, studios distanced themselves, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow, because no matter how many consequences he faced, nothing could give her back what he had taken: her peace, her safety, her reflection. She couldn't walk into a room without wondering who had seen the articles, who believed them, who didn't. She couldn't trust easily, not just others, but herself. Because that's what emotional abuse does. It makes you question your instincts, your memories, your worth. And even when the abuser is gone, the doubt lingers like smoke. She started therapy, not to forget, but to understand. She began to piece together the fragments of her old self, the girl who used to laugh without flinching, who used to trust without trembling. Slowly, she began to rebuild, not into who she was, but into someone wiser, stronger, more aware. She knew now that pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in perfectly worded texts and sweet gestures that leave bruises on your soul. She knew now that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they sit across from you, at dinner, smiling. And she knew beyond all doubt that telling the truth would always be worth the noise it created, because silence might be safer, but it's never free. The more Courtney spoke, the more the world began to listen, not just to her, but to the other women, whose voices came forward like waves crashing against a dam that had held back pain for far too long. Each story carried pieces of the same nightmare: the charm, the control, the obsession, the strange obsession with blood and flesh and fear. Courtney watched as a pattern emerged, one she had lived but hadn't fully seen, and suddenly she didn't feel alone. She felt furious. Furious that it had happened, furious that it had been allowed, furious that so many still dared to call it fantasy instead of abuse. The media dissected everything. Her tone, her words, her past, as if they had the right to measure her credibility by how well she performed her trauma. She didn't owe them tears, or theatrics, or proof in the form they preferred. She owed herself the truth, and she had already paid the price for it in nights lost to fear, in moments where her own reflection looked foreign, in years she would never get back. The messages he sent her, once confusing, now horrifying, lived in her phone like digital ghosts, and sometimes when she dared to scroll back, she'd feel the nausea rise like it did when she was still under his spell. He had said things no one should ever say, fantasies involving broken bones, feeding on her, devouring her soul, and he had done it with a calmness that, in retrospect, was more terrifying than if he had screamed. That was the part no one understood, how smooth abuse could sound when it came from someone with perfect diction, a famous smile, and expensive taste. Courtney wasn't trying to destroy him, she was trying to reclaim herself. And in doing so, she became something more powerful than a headline. She became a mirror for every woman who had ever been told that pain was pleasure, that fear was part of the game, that love meant surrender. She began to write more, not for the public, but for herself, pages filled with memories, with truths she had swallowed, with names of women who messaged her privately and said, "Me too, but I'm not ready to speak." And Courtney always replied with the same sentence, "You don't have to speak to be brave, surviving is enough." She had found strength in her vulnerability, light in her darkness, and slowly she began to believe what she had forgotten, that she was not what he made her feel like, not a possession, not a toy, not a victim, but a woman who rose, bleeding, burning, and still beautiful, from a love that never was love at all. In the end, Courtney Vucekovich didn't need validation from the world or an apology from him, or even the courtroom consequences that never fully matched the damage done. What she needed and finally gave herself was permission to breathe again, to feel safe in her own skin, and to exist without being haunted by the ghost of someone who had once called his violence love. She had survived something most people couldn't understand, something that wasn't visible in photographs, something that didn't always leave bruises but carved itself into the corners of her mind like an echo that never stopped bouncing. She still had days when the memories came uninvited. A certain word, a scent, the ping of a message, and for a split second her chest would tighten, her heart would race, and she would have to remind herself that she was no longer his. But now, she had tools, words, boundaries, a voice, and more importantly, she had reclaimed her reflection. The woman who stared back at her in the mirror wasn't broken anymore. She was bruised, yes, but unbowed, wiser, and no longer ashamed of the silence she had once kept. Courtney began using her platform not to dwell on the past, but to build a future for herself and for others, speaking not only about the abuse, but about healing, about resilience, about the quiet victories that come after surviving something designed to consume you. She supported other survivors, not as a savior, but as a sister, someone who understood the language of trauma, who didn't flinch at pain, who knew that sometimes just being believed can change a life. She never once glamorized what she went through. She told it like it was, raw, messy, unfiltered, because the truth didn't need decoration, it just needed space to be heard. Armie Hammer's career crumbled in slow motion, project by project, endorsement by endorsement, but Courtney didn't watch with satisfaction, because justice, when delayed and incomplete, doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like survival with a bitter taste. Still, she carried on. She laughed again, fell in love again, not carelessly, but intentionally, with people, with art, with herself. The world called it a scandal. She called it escape. And though his name will forever be tied to hers in headlines and in her heart, she had finally severed that cord. She would always carry the memory, not as shame, but as proof that she had walked through hell, been branded by fear, stripped of her voice, and still she chose herself, not once, but every day after.